She sat motionless, lips pressed tight, as Elvis, yes, that Elvis, whispered sweet nothings to women draped in perfume and miniskirts, all while reading scripture aloud like a preacher. The air was thick with Chanel No. 5 and betrayal. But what happened next? Even she couldn't believe it. In one haunting moment, she made a choice that teetered between heartbreak and desperation. What could push someone so close to the edge, so quietly, so suddenly? You think you know the story, but the truth behind the king's late-night rituals will leave you stunned. In the mid-1960s, long after the last spotlight had dimmed and the screaming fans had faded into silence, a different kind of gathering took place behind closed doors at Elvis Presley's lavish Bel Air estate. Night after night, under the soft glow of chandelier lights and hushed reverence, the king wasn't performing rock and roll. He was reading the Bible. But this wasn't your average spiritual study group. These were long, intense sessions that stretched into the early hours, with Elvis delivering verses like a man on a mission, his voice booming with dramatic flair, every word weighted like gospel. But what truly made these late-night rituals so unusual wasn't the scripture, it was the audience. Picture this: a group of young women dressed more for a Hollywood club than a religious circle, with plunging necklines and miniskirts barely brushing their thighs. They sat spellbound, eyes wide and shining, as if Elvis were reciting secrets straight from heaven. He wasn't just reading, he was captivating them, answering questions with flirtatious winks, offering compliments with a sly grin. One comment about perfume, one chuckle at a follower's quip, and suddenly it was less book of Psalms and more personal sermon for his inner circle of admirers. And there, quietly enduring it all, was Priscilla. Perched beside him on the couch, she smiled tightly, her heart sinking just a little deeper with every coy glance he cast toward the others. She watched as these so-called spiritual gatherings morphed into bizarre performances, unsure whether she was witnessing a man in search of faith or feeding his own ego. The lines blurred until she no longer knew where devotion ended and seduction began. Every night felt more like a test she never signed up for, and one that was wearing her down, piece by piece. Desperation has a way of creeping in quietly, doesn't it? One moment, you're sitting beside the person you love, convinced they'll sense your discomfort, your silence, your slipping smile, and then nothing. That's exactly where Priscilla found herself. Surrounded by worshipful eyes and flirtatious glances that weren't hers, she slipped out of the room without a word. Upstairs, her fingers moved automatically, sliding open the closet door, pulling out that dress. Tight, black, sleek, the one she knew Elvis liked best. If words couldn't pull him back to her, maybe a lure would. Maybe if she could remind him of what he had, he'd stop handing pieces of himself to everyone else. She came back into the room carefully, almost theatrically. Every step a silent hope that he would turn, see her, and finally feel something. But what she walked into was more of the same. Elvis, in his element, eyes gleaming, voice rising as he read scripture to his adoring circle, like a rock star turned preacher. Her absence? Not acknowledged. Her effort? Invisible. The dress? Not even a blink. She sat down beside him again, now cloaked in the same invisible ink that seemed to scrawl across every part of her being that night. It wasn't just that he didn't notice, it was that he never even looked. I managed to conceal my distress behind a fake smile and an attentive gaze, she would later write, years after that haunting evening. But I couldn't help noticing that he was responding to them with an occasional wink or smile. And with that one quiet confession, you can feel the sting, the sharp realization that the person you've built your world around is too busy playing Messiah to notice the silent unraveling happening right beside him. Humiliation is a quiet kind of rage. It doesn't scream, it simmers. And that's exactly what Priscilla felt as she excused herself from the room that night. Not with a dramatic exit, not with tears, but with a chill that ran deeper than anger. She climbed the stairs slowly, not because she was tired, but because every step felt like a descent into something darker. Upstairs, surrounded by the echoes of laughter from the other room, she wasn't just heartbroken, she was invisible. Whatever was left of her pride had been crushed beneath the weight of yet another night of being ignored. She stood in front of her vanity, the silence wrapping around her like a cloak. Her eyes drifted toward the nightstand. A bottle half full, maybe more, of Placidals stared back at her. That's when the idea struck. Not a cry for help, not a desperate plea, a plan, something theatrical, calculated, a kind of emotional counterattack. If he won't notice my dress, my presence, or my pain, maybe he'll notice this. The thought wasn't suicidal, it was symbolic, a staged display of surrender designed to pierce through his indifference, if only for a second. She moved with eerie precision, as if directing her own tragic performance. A quick shower, makeup retouched, lashes curled just right. Her favorite camisole, delicate and soft, chosen like a costume. She fluffed the pillows, dimmed the lights, positioned herself on the bed with a romance novel carefully left open nearby, one of his favorites. It had to look effortless, serene, as if she'd simply drifted into a slumber too deep to wake from. The scene was set. All that remained was the final act. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took the first 2 pills. Not enough to harm, just enough to seem convincing. But as she sat there, bottle still in hand, something kept her awake. It wasn't the pills, it was the noise, his laughter, floating up from downstairs warm and unbothered. A stark contrast to the storm twisting inside her. And with every chuckle she heard, her chest tightened. How could he be so unaware? The plan had been for drama, for effect, but now it felt more like defeat. In the end, she never followed through. The rest of the pills remained untouched. The scene, perfectly staged, went unnoticed. When Elvis finally wandered into the room later, he found her lying there and simply assumed she'd fallen asleep reading. He tucked her in gently, kissed her goodnight, and left without asking a single question. And yet, in that small gesture, that fleeting brush of affection, her rage cracked. Because even though he didn't know the performance she'd crafted, even though he hadn't seen the pain behind the stillness, that tiny moment of tenderness, it was enough to disarm her. For now. Eventually, the door creaked open, and in walked Elvis. Calm, composed, completely unaware of the emotional hurricane that had passed through that very room just hours earlier. The dim light cast soft shadows across Priscilla's still frame. Her breathing slow, her eyes closed just enough to convince him she dozed off peacefully with a book still resting near her side. He didn't ask questions. He didn't notice the carefully chosen camisole or the faint smudge of fresh eyeliner. Instead, he quietly lifted the edge of a blanket and draped it over her like a parent would a sleeping child. Then came the kiss, a soft press of his lips against her forehead, fleeting and tender. And just like that, he turned to leave, never knowing what he'd almost walked in on. In that moment, just a kiss, just a blanket, something inside her cracked. The anger that had burned so hot all night, that had fueled a nearly catastrophic decision, seemed to flicker and fade. She had gone to such great lengths to be seen, to be felt, to mean something again. And all it took to unravel her fury was that brief, unexpected sliver of affection. Not a grand apology, not words, just a blanket and a kiss. It wasn't logical, it wasn't fair, but it was enough to remind her, even briefly, of why she still held on. Because in their world, twisted, electric, full of highs so high and lows so crushing, those little gestures meant everything. A wink, a compliment, a shared glance. For Priscilla, love wasn't measured in consistency, it was measured in moments. Rare, fragile moments where she felt like she mattered again. It didn't make the pain disappear. It didn't change what had happened earlier that night. But for a second, wrapped in that blanket and clinging to the ghost of a kiss, she let herself believe in the version of him who still cared. Eventually, the door creaked open, and in walked Elvis. Calm, composed, completely unaware of the emotional hurricane that had passed through that very room just hours earlier. The dim light cast soft shadows across Priscilla's still frame. Her breathing slow, her eyes closed just enough to convince him she dozed off peacefully with a book still resting near her side. He didn't ask questions. He didn't notice the carefully chosen camisole or the faint smudge of fresh eyeliner. Instead, he quietly lifted the edge of a blanket and draped it over her like a parent would a sleeping child. Then came the kiss, a soft press of his lips against her forehead, fleeting and tender. And just like that, he turned to leave, never knowing what he'd almost walked in on. In that moment, just a kiss, just a blanket, something inside her cracked. The anger that had burned so hot all night, that had fueled a nearly catastrophic decision, seemed to flicker and fade. She had gone to such great lengths to be seen, to be felt, to mean something again. And all it took to unravel her fury was that brief, unexpected sliver of affection. Not a grand apology, not words, just a blanket and a kiss. It wasn't logical, it wasn't fair, but it was enough to remind her, even briefly, of why she still held on. Because in their world, twisted, electric, full of highs so high and lows so crushing, those little gestures meant everything. A wink, a compliment, a shared glance. For Priscilla, love wasn't measured in consistency, it was measured in moments. Rare, fragile moments where she felt like she mattered again. It didn't make the pain disappear. It didn't change what had happened earlier that night. But for a second, wrapped in that blanket and clinging to the ghost of a kiss, she let herself believe in the version of him who still cared. This wasn't about a dress. It wasn't about perfume, or even the groupies clinging to every word he read like scripture. What happened that night was never just a dramatic cry for attention. It was something deeper, far more haunting. It was the culmination of years spent orbiting someone who consumed all the light in the room. Priscilla wasn't just hurt, she was fading. Slowly, silently, she was becoming a shadow in the very life she helped build. Her act with the sleeping pills wasn't a performance, it was a desperate attempt to feel real again in a world that had rendered her invisible. Because the truth is, Elvis's world was filled with rituals, devotion, and the illusion of connection. There were always people around him, adoring fans, loyal followers, women who hung on every word. But none of it filled the empty spaces between them. Priscilla had given up pieces of herself to keep up, to be the perfect partner, the elegant figure by his side. Yet night after night, in a house full of people, she sat alone. The neglect wasn't cruel, not in the obvious sense. It was quiet, passive, wrapped in soft kisses and warm blankets that made you think everything was fine until it wasn't. So when she lay there motionless, waiting for him to see her, to really see her, what was she hoping for? A moment of recognition? A pause in his performance? Or maybe, just maybe, she wasn't trying to wake him up at all. Maybe she was trying to wake herself. Because when your life becomes someone else's story, sometimes the only way to find your place again is to rewrite the ending. If this story moved you, or even made you see things from a whole new angle, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the lives behind the legends. Like the video if it kept you hooked, and most importantly, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? Was Priscilla's act a silent scream for help, or something even more complex? Drop your thoughts and opinions in the comments. We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them. Let's keep the conversation going.